There's one other thing that happened here today, which I want to underscore, which is that we're getting more information now about how the upper reaches of the Trump administration knew. They knew at the time that what President Trump was doing in jerking Ukraine around like this to get them to help him with his reelection effort, that effort by the president, the Trump White House knew at the time, they were told at the time what the cost was of the president doing that. Who would ultimately benefit from the president doing that, in addition to the president trying to benefit himself? Jennifer Williams is a Foreign Service officer. She started her career under the George W. Bush administration at the Department of Homeland Security. She went out of her way to say she worked at the Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Michael Chertoff, who was George W. Bush's one of his Homeland Security appointees. She went out of her way today to say that her hero is Condoleezza Rice. She bent over backwards today to make sure that her comments about Vice President Mike Pence were nothing but good, or at least neutral, or at least ambiguous if need be. I mean, this was not a witness who was on an anti-Trump administration crusade. I mean, none of them are, but she went out of her way to make clear that she definitely isn't. But as a factual matter and a matter of her expertise and her job responsibilities, she staffs Vice President Pence on the issue of Ukraine. And so now, through her testimony today, we know what Ukraine's president explained out loud to Mike Pence, to the Vice President of the United States, told him to his face in person about what the effect was of what President Trump was doing by jerking Ukraine around this way. Not only that he was hurting Ukraine, but the Ukrainian president told Mike Pence to his face directly who that was helping.
President Zelensky explained that more than, or just equally with the financial and physical value of the assistance, that it was the symbolic nature of that assistance that really was the show of U.S. support for Ukraine and for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think he was stressing that to the vice president to really underscore the need for the security assistance to be released.
And that if the United States was holding the security assistance, is it also true then that Russia could see that as a sign of weakening U.S. support for Ukraine and take advantage of that?
I believe that's what the President Zelensky was indicating, that any signal or sign that U.S. support was wavering would be construed by Russia as potentially an opportunity for them to strengthen their own hand in Ukraine.
That point about how President Trump's actions, his actions at the heart of this impeachment, were ultimately to the benefit of Russia. That came home as well today on the specific issue of this theory, this foreign, can I call it a foreign theory, this odd theory, that not only Rudy Giuliani and President Trump were pushing in this Ukraine scheme, but the Republicans defending President Trump in these impeachment proceedings, they have been pushing this theory as well at the hearings. Watch.
What was the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign? In these depositions and hearings, Republicans have cited numerous indications of Ukraine meddling in the 2016 elections to oppose the Trump campaign.
Oh, the Ukraine meddling in the 2016 election. The way Ukraine intervened in the election to mess with us as Americans to try to get Hillary Clinton elected. You know, if the history of this moment is well written, this ought to be some of the enduring residue of this impeachment when it's all over. Because, yes, the president is being impeached for trying to get a foreign country to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden. Literally everyone who has testified, even the Trump appointees, who the Republicans specifically requested, they've all conceded that that's bad. A president shouldn't ask foreign countries to investigate his political rival. But at the same time that the president was asking Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, the president was also trying to get Ukraine to provide him some kind of investigation, something to back up this cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs idea that it wasn't Russia that interfered in the 2016 election. It was some other country who did it. It was Ukraine. And President Trump was pushing for that on the phone with the president of Ukraine. And some of the Republicans in Congress are pushing that theory themselves at these impeachment hearings. while the entire U.S. intelligence community says, no, actually, it was Russia that did it. And the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee says, no, it was Russia that did it. And a dozen Russian military intelligence officers are under indictment right now by the Justice Department for that attack because, yes, it was Russia who did it. And against all of that evidence and all of those, we thought, relatively non-controversial conclusions, where does this alternate theory come from? That Russia didn't actually do it. That Russia didn't interfere in the election. That's a hoax. It was Ukraine that interfered in the election. Where did that come from? I mean, that is as much a part of this impeachment in terms of what Trump was trying to get out of Ukraine as the thing about Joe Biden. He's trying to get Ukraine to give him backup for this cockamamie theory that Russia didn't do it. Ukraine was the real meddler in our elections. Where does that come from? Well, among the other things we're getting from these witnesses at all of these hearings is that they're all subject matter experts, right? They're all subject matter expert fact witnesses who really know Ukraine and really know that part of the world. And they actually know the answer to that question of where that cockamamie theory comes from.
Now, at the time of this July 25th call, Colonel Vindman, were you aware of a theory that Ukraine had intervened or interfered in the 2016 U.S. election?
I was.
Are you aware of any credible evidence to support this theory?
I am not.
Are you also aware that Vladimir Putin had promoted this theory of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election?
I am well aware of that fact.
And ultimately, which country did U.S. intelligence services determine to have interfered in the 2016 election?
It is the consensus of the entire intelligence community that the Russians interfered in U.S. elections in 2016.
You both listened in real time to the July 25th call. In particular, you would have heard President Trump ask the president of Ukraine, quote, "I'd like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike," and quote, "the server, they say Ukraine has it." This is a debunked conspiracy theory that has no basis in fact. President Trump's own former Homeland Security advisor, Thomas P. Bossert, called the president's assertion that Ukraine intervened in the 2016 elections, quote, "not only a conspiracy theory, but quote unquote, completely debunked," unquote. Colonel Vindman, are you aware of any evidence to support the theory that the Ukrainian government interfered in the 2016 election?
Congressman, I am not, and furthermore, I would say that this is a Russian narrative that President Putin has promoted.
And are you aware of any part of the U.S. government, its foreign policy or intelligence apparatus that supports that theory?
No.
No, just the president. Just the president and the Republicans who are defending him in this impeachment hearing. They're the only ones who are supporting that Russian narrative that President Putin has promoted. The whole entire U.S. intelligence community and every part of the foreign policy and intelligence apparatus of this country, the entirety of the U.S. government concedes that it was Russia who did it. But the president is pushing this Russian narrative that President Putin has promoted, and now his supporters in Congress are pushing that too. I mean, in the end, when does the end come? In the end, someone will write a book, or someone will run a presidential campaign on this basis, or someone will at least make a great TV show someday about the fact that in this impeachment of this president, one of the things the president was impeached for, and the way some of his supporters in Congress defended him at his impeachment hearings, was by promulgating a Russian government-promoted conspiracy theory that was designed to exonerate that country for their attack on us in 2016. I mean, someday that story will be written. And in the future, no one will freaking believe that we lived through that in 2019 in the United States of America. Someday that story is coming. But as of tonight, we are still right in the throes of these guys getting caught. More ahead.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.